Everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be the Game Week 21 cheat sheet. And if you haven't watched the cheat sheet series before, it's effectively a series where I look at all the assets in FPL and rank them by position, but also by price point, looking at what is the most efficient player, in my opinion, at this point in time, looking at Game Week 21, forecasting ahead to a couple of fixtures, but also looking at, for example, things like underlying stats so far this season, previous seasons as well, and what we know based on what managers have said, etc., etc. As far as the midfield cheat sheet, obviously this position has been hit the hardest by outgoing players in terms of players who are now at the Asian Cup or AFCON. And I think that the reality, of course, is that if you've invested previously into a South Korean player or even a player like Mo Salah, the reality, of course, is that we are expecting these players to go quite deep into their respective tournaments. And so it doesn't really make sense, right, to actually hold the two of them at the very bare minimum. I think at least for most managers, you're considering, selling one of the two of them or even two out of two of them as soon as this week or the week after the next. In terms of the midfield position, what's interesting this week when we look at the budget players is that ultimately these budget players might actually allow you to keep someone like Salah or Son in your team, right? Players like Garnacho, Douglas Luiz, and Palmer, they are very good picks. And the reason why they're good is because they're players who are actually posting really reasonable underlying stats or have a lot of intangibles, right? Intangibles are things like set pieces, penalties as well. So you don't necessarily get them rated per se through underlying stats, but those are reflected by sometimes sort of really freaky game scores. For example, Douglas Luiz, if you look at just pure expected goal involvement as a sort of slightly deeper central midfield type player, he's not going to have crazy underlying stats. But the reality, of course, is as a penalty taker for this Aston Villa team, that's going to sort of increase his value as an FPL asset. Generally speaking, I would say you'd expect for stronger teams to have more penalties. And fortunately, of course, for the way that things have fallen for Douglas Luiz so far, he's done well. The only thing I would say is that maybe Game Weeks 21 and 22 aren't particularly good fixtures. Whereas, for example, when you look ahead to someone like Palmer, still looks incredible even as a captaincy option in Game Week 21. So if I was to actually prioritize a transfer in for one of these players, it would be Palmer. But I can understand people doubling up on players from this price point or even tripling up. Particularly, as I said, if you want to keep one of those sort of AFCON/Asian Cup players and you want to hold them up until maybe they come back, say, let's say Game Week 24 or Game Week 25. Now, in terms of some of the differentials here, I've got Elanga. Elanga's been playing brilliantly, and I think part of that too is the change under Nuno. Of course, you've seen some minutes change for certain players, right? Chris Wood, for example, has benefited a lot. Elanga himself too, and you can see, for example, over December, his output was amazing, but actually his underlying stats are also pretty consistent. So nice to see, particularly if you can look at Elanga as a 90-minute player, what you can really get from him with that sort of consistency. Previously under Steve Cook, unfortunately, we did see a lot of chop and changing with his team at times, and so even though Elanga was brilliant at times, didn't have the minutes. Now it seems like he does. As far as Bailey, I think the concern still is that with the Aston Villa team sort of coming closer to sort of full strength, having more players coming back from injury, from suspension as well, that sort of reduces his minutes, right? Because compared to, let's say, Douglas Luiz, who in my opinion is still probably at bare minimum an 85-minute player, you can't really say the same about Bailey. And generally speaking, of course, if you look historically, he has had issues with fitness and in general, for example, just recurring injury issues, even if they're, let's say, small-term ones. As far as Andreas, I still think that unfortunately, you're not getting the guarantees of minutes with him now. I previously thought, for example, he'd be a little bit better than Willian in terms of minutes guarantees, but that's unlikely to be the case. We've seen, for example, some games where he's been benched, and so I still don't really have that sort of confidence in him as a pick, and so that's why he drops. I think you can even consider him effectively out of the cheat sheet. I think that's maybe a little bit of overestimation on my part in terms of Andreas' abilities. But unfortunately, of course, with the sort of losing of penalties to someone like Willian, who doesn't even actually play every single game for Fulham, you still can't have any guarantees really of Andreas being an elite pick. As far as, let's say, the 6.x players, Richarlison's an interesting one where I haven't really changed his position whatsoever at all. And part of that is because Richarlison, in my opinion, is someone who is very good for the short-term run, right? Where we know that Son is out, but also Timo Werner is coming into the Spurs team. Timo Werner, of course, will have to sort of work his way to match fitness because he hasn't really been playing too much for Red Bull Leipzig. And on top of that, of course, he sort of has to sort of train under Ange and sort of build his fitness up to understand exactly what he's going to play role-wise in the structure. I think it's more than likely you can see him play both left wing and center forward, and that's exactly where they needed depth, right? When Son was playing, arguably you could say that the only two sort of left wing / center forward players was actually both Richarlison and Son. So those two players actually sort of playing cross roles is helpful. You of course had Brian Hill, you also had Valise, but I think they're a little bit of a drop off compared to what, let's say, Timo Werner could bring to the table in terms of his level of experience. And so it makes sense, of course, that they're covering that sort of depth. It also allows, for example, Ange in certain situations to, let's say, bench Richarlison at 65 minutes and know that there's quite a competent sort of elite player who could come in, right, and step in and take those minutes if, let's say, Timo Werner can step up to the challenge. As far as Son, of course, is the same thing there, where, of course, as I said, if Richarlison coming off, there could be instances in time where, let's say, you want to move Son to a centre forward position, but if there's not enough depth, you're sort of stuck and forced to have Son out wide, although Son incredibly has played really well out wide the last 2 to 3 games. As far as Gross, I think he gets an absolute rise, and I think if anything, he'd probably still be my priority transfer as a midfielder this week. I think when you look at all the midfielders in this position, there's a lot of sort of things going against them, right? Even if I look at someone like Garnacho, who I gave a rise in that sort of budget position, I think the one risk really is that Man United still are a pretty horrific footballing team. And of course, you can see that his underlying stats aren't particularly good. Plus, of course, there is a pretty small but unfortunate chance where, of course, let's say if Garnacho does run off of form, I suppose you can see players like Rashford take more minutes, Antony take more minutes as well. But it's very unlikely, right? Because I still think Garnacho has probably been their best attacker in this short stint, and it's very unlikely that Ten Hag will bench him anytime soon. As far as Gross, though, you have the guarantees in terms of wherever he's sort of placed on the pitch, he will be on the pitch. And for a bare minimum of what I would say would be 85 minutes for this Brighton team. You can see him play roles like fullback, center mid, even the 10 spot, even arguably wing positions at times when he's needed to play there. But it seems like they're going to get someone like Barco coming into the team. They have some players coming back from injury, so that does help in terms of, let's say, the full strength of this Brighton team. But arguably, it drops Gross a little bit deeper into the pitch, makes him play as a center mid. Now, that's not necessarily a problem. For example, you look at the previous FA Cup game, was able to get 2 assists there. He does sort of play a lot of roles, and he also has sort of the intangibles that I talked about in terms of set pieces and things like that. So I think Gross, particularly considering that he also has a really good fixture run, is an elite asset and ultimately very, very good to sort of pick up right now. He also doesn't really have chances of blanking in the future, which I think sort of is a good positive, right, compared to some of the other assets in the field who could very well blank in Game Week 29 or blank, for example, in Game Week 26. As far as, let's say, Eze, I've added him to the cheat sheet. Part of this, of course, is simply just the Olise injury. This means you have Eze, who's basically on most set pieces, on penalties for sure. And look, ultimately, the way Roy Hodgson, unfortunately, is managing players in terms of their fitness, it's very likely that Eze is going to get good minutes. The question, I suppose, is there a chance where his injury and his sort of overusage, maybe under Roy, could sort of come back to bite him the same way I guess it has with Olise? I don't want to criticize Roy too much, but ultimately that is a small risk with Eze. Otherwise, it's very good. You could argue, of course, the overall attacking quality of the team will drop off without, let's say, a creator like Olise. But I think all you have to look at is, for example, a team like Spurs. Like a lot of people are saying that the drop off would have been catastrophic without a key creator like Maddison. Ultimately, I think what we know is, and what we've seen time and time again, is that with footballing teams, ultimately, even though you might lose a key player, I don't think there's going to be a significant drop off from the team. Crystal Palace, even from a starting position, really wasn't a great attacking team, and as they still looked pretty competent then. We've seen some great hauls, for example, from Eze and Olise recently. They're still capable of that, considering the fixtures that they have. And Sheffield United at home is exactly one of them, after you sort of bear the Arsenal away fixture. If anything, I think Eze is more of a Game Week 22 transfer. So I wouldn't really be considering him this week, but certainly, for example, if you, let's say, we're waiting to replace one of Salah and Son next week, and you're sort of thinking about a two-way transfer to bring Haaland in, I think Eze is sort of perfect for that sort of position. Paqueta, unfortunately, seems like he's injured. We won't really get a conclusive update on him, unfortunately, because of the way press conferences sort of fall before the Game Week 21 deadline. So unfortunately, I still think there's a huge asterisk over him. As far as Bowen, you have the same asterisk over him, but I still think that he's probably most likely going to be back fit. Although I think Moyes did actually sort of speak about Bowen's injury and said, unfortunately, it is a condition or a situation of waiting and seeing. Maybe, hopefully, we'll get some Bowen training photos, and that will sort of shoot him up to sort of being one of the priority picks as a transfer in this week. But it's still hard, right? I would wait pretty much until the end of the deadline, if possible, to sort of get that news on Bowen and to get that sort of conclusive news, if possible. As far as, let's say, Foden, I still think, as I've been sort of championing within some of my videos, that I still think he's a very high quality asset. And a lot of people will of course mention many times where Pep has a fully rotatable squad, has a squad without injuries, which is the case right now, that Foden of course will lose minutes. And I think that's inevitable, yes. But the question, I suppose, is Foden with, let's say, an average of, let's say, maybe 72 minutes per game good enough? And potentially, I think with the double game week in 25, that is. But part of that, of course, is unfortunately there's a small probability that that double game week in 25 might not happen or might not come into fruition. So really, it's a 0 or 100. And so I think you have to be quite invested into sort of the condition that double game week 25 will happen to make Foden sort of an elite asset. I still think, though, that his minutes are quite safe in the short term, because you also have to think KDB and Haaland are coming back from some pretty severe injuries or severe time off. And so you can hear, for example, let's say even from Kevin De Bruyne's quotes himself, or how, for example, City have been treating Haaland, not even in the squad, for example, versus Huddersfield, that it's very likely that Foden will get a lot of good short-term minutes. And some of these fixtures are still very, very good. Even when you're looking at, for example, Newcastle away, that still looks like a good game on paper because of how bad this Newcastle attack have recently looked. And I don't think it's not even a case of them letting in goals. It's even the expected goals conceded recently that has been absurdly high for Newcastle, and has even thrown them out of like statistical models for us to no longer consider them really as a top 3 defense. I mean, they've dropped so far that even on expected goals conceded, you're looking at them as a bottom half team, which is just how crazy it is, but also how astronomical that result Liverpool were able to get them was. Ultimately, though, if you just look at the short term, last 5 to 6 fixtures for Newcastle, it is very bad. And that's even with, for example, the full strength team. It's just very clear that for whatever issue, I guess fitness potentially as well, that Newcastle are not able to sort of keep up with the demand so far of, let's say, competitive football. But of course, they're also out of competition, so you might also see them, ease back into things as fixtures sweeten by game 23. So in that sort of context, I still think that, for example, Gordon, he still makes sense as a yellow asset until basically game 23 happens. As far as, let's say, someone like Diogo Jota, I think he's in a similar camp to Foden, right? Because you've got chances of, let's say, blank game 26, chances of double game 25 as well for a team like Liverpool. Pretty high chances too of double game of blank game 29. The only thing with Diogo Jota that I would say is that unfortunately he looks incredible, right? And he does feel like a bit of a poison pill though, because when Salah comes back, of course, his minutes will be sort of thrown into the question, and I think his sort of validity as a pick will probably drop a little bit. So he does feel like a short-term punt. So when I look at someone like Richarlison and Diogo Jota, they are great as short-term punts, but you need to understand that you're investing into a short-term punt. I would even say maybe the same with Foden, right? After game 25, it's probably a good time to sort of bin him. But these are sort of players where we know that the ceiling is high. We know that if they actually get these minutes that they should get over the short-term period, that they're going to be electric. For example, Richarlison on penalties is going to be lovely. Diogo Jota with really good minutes is going to be lovely. And so the question, as I say, is can you field a short-term punt in your team, and are you planning around it? So that's the only thing I would say with players like Foden, Diogo Jota, and Richarlison. When you contrast, for example, to players like Bowen and Gross, I mean, their minutes will always be guaranteed, and they don't really have any blanks on the horizon. So that's the sort of comparison and contrasting that you used to do in terms of your squad building. Potentially, you get one nailed player and one player who's a bit more of a short-term punt, and that can actually allow you with, let's say, booking in your transfers in the future. But something to keep in mind, of course. As far as Sterling, unfortunately, he falls. He's played well for most of the season for Chelsea, and I don't really think that you can really question, for example, that Sterling, if he was playing every single match with good minutes, is a well-priced player. I think he is. However, the question is that ultimately Chelsea's fixture run is sort of coming to an end, and second of all, it doesn't really seem like he has the intangibles that we want, right? Yes, he's on direct free kicks, but he's not on penalties. And unfortunately with Sterling too, we're starting to see that with players like Madueke playing extremely well. And unfortunately, of course, there is a little bit of a benefit that Nkunku's out for a while, or that Mudryk has sustained some injuries. But I think the reality is that this Chelsea team is deep enough, and he's not playing well enough, I suppose, to sort of maintain a consistent starting spot within this team, which is why, of course, you saw, for example, a benching even after the suspension game, right? When Cole Palmer was suspended and got his 5th yellow card, he came back immediately to play 90 minutes for Chelsea. On the other hand, you saw Sterling on the bench the whole time. So that for me just shows the contrast in terms of the minutes between Palmer and Sterling, and where they are at right now in terms of importance for their teams. So things have certainly changed. As far as Saka, Odegaard, Fernandes, no changes there. I still think I'd place all these players exactly where they are. I still think I have more confidence, for example, in the Arsenal offense than I do with the Man United offense, which is exactly why I've got Saka, Odegaard, and Fernandes split the way they do. KDB is someone that I've added as a differential, but I put a huge asterisk onto him. And the issue with KDB anyways is that he simply just has an asterisk around him, because he's even been quoted to be saying that he expects himself to be on the bench versus Newcastle. So First of all, it doesn't even make sense to bring in KDB in Game Week 21, even though Newcastle looks like an absolute plum fixture. Reality, of course, is that he's probably going to be benched, as he even suggests himself. And after that, too, based on, let's say, press conference comments, and what we know, of course, from a player coming back from such a severe injury, is that he does need to build match fitness, and it's going to be a slow process, right? City have a lot of things to compete for. They have many fixtures left, many competitions to play for, and it makes sense to have KDB, back at full fitness. I just really can't guarantee his sort of level of fitness, even though the January games are quite sporadic. So what I would say is with KDB, it's a bit more of a touch and go thing, where until we really see him rack up, serious minutes and look seriously fit, I can't really condone, suggesting KDB as a transfer option, and that's pretty much where we are at right now with the midfield position. As far as the forward position, there's not too many changes. I think the biggest change is that João Pedro shoots up to the absolute top for me. Part of this is because you can see that Roberto De Zerbi is finally extremely hot on what João Pedro is bringing into the team. It's taken him a while. We're basically half a season in, and the sort of press conference comments on João Pedro are absolutely glowing compared to a couple of weeks ago when, for example, he was getting consistently benched and he was mentioning that there were still little things that João Pedro needs to work on. Part of this too, of course, and part of what has reinforced João Pedro's minutes is injuries to players like Matoma or even Adingler, right? Right now you're losing two key wingers for the team, and João Pedro has been able to play out wide and service them incredibly well. For example, the Tottenham game is a good example of how, let's say, of how much RDZ was super happy with his performance. And so I think in this sort of context, in this sort of landscape now, with Brighton having a basically beautiful run and him being on penalties, I just can't say João Pedro's anything but a green asset. However, the reality too is that with Haaland coming back, you're still restricted to 3 forward spots, right? I think very conceivably, if you already own Watkins, there's no need to sort of bring Watkins out of your team unless you're trying to save up money for whatever reason. And so I think the 3 best forwards that I would suggest right now would still be Solanke, Watkins, and Haaland. And part of that is because even though Solanke has 2 technically bad fixtures left in terms of, let's say, Liverpool at home and then West Ham away a little bit debatable because I think West Ham are a pretty bad defense still. But the reality is that there's going to be a double game week fixture that's quite likely to be sort of rescheduled over the next 8 game weeks, right? Somewhere between game weeks 23 and 28 is where we expect, or even game week 32 as well, for a Solanke fixture to fall. But also Solanke is performing incredibly well. He has basically everything that you want ever in an FPL asset, and for that reason, he's still a great pick. Of course, João Pedro, I think at his sort of price point, he does sort of hold a candle to someone like Solanke and even like someone like Watkins in particular, someone like Watkins who doesn't have penalties, but still is boasting really good underlying stats. So that's the question to ask. And as you can see, of course, João Pedro has sort of really good expected goal involvement per 90 and seems to have, finally a condition where he's going to be playing close to 90 minutes a game. Whereas when I compare to, let's say, like Calvert-Lewin, who also has really good underlying stats too, his question, of course, is fitness, always. He can be on the bench at times, or he can just play 70 minutes. Very rare that we really see, for example, a true 90-minute game from Calvert-Lewin. As far as Alvarez, I've given him a fall, but a very small fall. Of course, with Haaland coming back soon, the biggest thing is Haaland, I think, will also be somewhat eased in, right? It's not going to be that he's going to suddenly come back into the squad and just immediately start versus Newcastle. I think that's a little bit out of the question for me. I'm expecting him to come off the bench for Newcastle, not even sure for how many minutes. And so, look, this is how Man City have treated him. This is how they've sort of understood the injury to be. I really think that we don't need to question that. So I think Alvarez's minutes are good for the short term, but you just know that he's going to be a transfer out in the future. And that's personally where I'm sat right now. I just think that the transfer doesn't have to be done until game week 22. As far as Darwin and Tony, these are still other yellow tier assets as well. Tony, for me, of course, is a player coming back. It seems like throughout the season, of course, he's been able to sort of develop match fitness and sort of closed friendly fixtures and so on and so forth. But there is, of course, a slight difference from a competitive level too. But I can't really question it too much. I think Tony should be fine. You're expecting a player to be on penalties. You're also expecting a player to be effectively the talisman and sort of the leading player for a team that actually is sort of top 8 in terms of expected goals so far this season. So that's a good look for Tony coming back into a Brentford team that unfortunately have been blighted by injuries as well. So that's the only sort of asterisk I would say pulling back against Tony. But really, if that double game 25 happens, it's very likely that we might be considering Tony for our teams very shortly too. With Wilson Isaac, I don't think anything has changed. Jesus, unfortunately, seems to also have some sort of injury concerns as well, so he's getting a drop. And Haaland, of course, is so close to coming back that I'm also going to give him a rise. But keep in mind, of course, that it's very likely that he will start on the bench versus Newcastle. As far as the defense this week, we don't have too many changes. Part of the changes have been sort of reflecting where players are at and where teams are at, right? In terms of the team perspective, I've had to drop Botman, right? This Newcastle team has really, really dropped off the cliff in terms of defensive sort of numbers. I would struggle to believe that they're suddenly going to sort of make a sudden U-turn until basically Game Week 23. So I think the question, of course, is that if you haven't been investing into Botman already, there's no reason to do so until Game Week 23. And if you've invested into Botman, I think, yes, you can probably wait until Game Week 23 when the fixtures turn really good to sort of reconsider, let's say, whether you want to continue owning him after that. But right now, of course, he's definitely no sort of priority transfer option in. As far as Colwill, even for example, a Chelsea team, I do think they've dropped off a little bit too. You can see that in terms of how the numbers are being reflected, but also Gusto is at such an exclusive sort of price point, and also a very attacking player too, mind you, that I still think that he's sort of a still great option. That's why there's a bit of a contrast here between someone like Colwill and Gusto. As far as Estupiñán, he's risen, I think, more than deserved. Same with Dunk as well. Reality is that the Brighton fixtures are perfect. Yes, of course, Estupiñán is sort of playing a left center back role, but I highly doubt that you'll see him sort of uninvolved in open play. Yes, of course, him sort of scoring long shots every single match is going to be an absolute oddity, and it's going to be absolutely absurd if it happens. It's not really going to be something that we expect, but I still think that Estupiñán will bring a lot in terms of the attacking structure of this team, and it's very likely, of course, that the attacking structure of this team plus the defensive structure of this team will change too, with players like Webster coming back fit, and maybe Brighton sort of playing around with what sort of formation they will be styling with, and Estupiñán coming back as well. So that for me is a huge benefit. I just think with the fixture run, he's a little bit of a no-brainer, particularly if you have an option really to sort of bring in someone as a transfer this week, or if, let's say, instead of playing like a formation where you need, let's say, 5 midfielders this week and you want to hold on to Salah plus Son, it would make sense, for example, to move into 4 defenders, move into 5 defenders, and have Estupiñán as one of those players within your team. So that would make a lot of sense. As far as Zinchenko, he gets a drop, unfortunately, due to the injury concerns. I think he was probably more so rested versus Liverpool, but of course we know that in the previous match in Game Week 20 that he was not available to play because of a calf injury or sort of situation. So we need to see how that develops before we sort of assess Zinchenko. That's why there's an asterisk over him, and that's pretty much it. With Virgil, I've given him a rise. I think when you look at, for example, most of the teams, they have sort of middling runs. Liverpool potentially could have a double game week as well, so that sort of makes Virgil interesting. So I would probably put Virgil a little bit above Trippier. Trippier, of course, was mentioned to sort of have an injury, but we know there's also rumors attached to Trippier, plus, of course, just generally bad fixtures until Game Week 23. Once again, as I said, I would just wait until Game Week 23 before you think about getting Trippier back into your teams. And in terms of, for example, Liverpool, it would make sense to sort of think about, let's say, owning a couple Liverpool assets if you're sort of planning to play around the potential happenings of, let's say, a double game 25 or something like that. But on the flip side, of course, you're sort of playing around with a pretty highly probable chance of a blank in game 26 as well. So as you move into Liverpool players such as Trent or such as Virgil, you do need to think about that in your mind. As far as goalkeepers this week, no real changes other than giving Areola a rise. I think the reality, of course, is that Areola is still at an absurd price point, for what he is as a goalkeeper. He is a very good shot stopper, and that's sort of the distinction that I made last week in terms of discussing why Flecken, for me, is someone that I really have very, very little faith in. I think we've had 20 games of sample size really this season, and Flecken is basically the worst shot stopper in the league from a statistical point of view when you, let's say, take away the Brighton keepers, because in my opinion they both haven't played enough. And then when you compare it to, let's say, Areola, he's done incredibly well in spite of West Ham being a pretty poor defensive team. So he's a good shot stopper, and at that sort of price point I don't think you can really complain. The recent hauls have definitely been sort of overperformance, right, when it comes to, let's say, expectations versus FPL points. And we saw that, for example, a couple of weeks ago when Pickford basically went on a 4 clean sheet run. It's not like, for example, Everton are suddenly the best defense in town, but it's the reality that sometimes the goalkeeper points can be extremely erratic. And of course, as long as you're a competent shot stopper, you can, for example, rack up these clean sheets out of nowhere. And that's exactly what Areola has done as of late, even versus a really good team like Arsenal. As far as, let's say, Dubravka and Neto, I've given Dubravka a fall. As I said, very, very hard to sort of rate this Newcastle team right now. Their defense is absolutely awful. And it's really interesting to see how bad it can get. Potentially, you might argue that it doesn't really get worse than, let's say, conceding 7.5 XG to a team in the Premier League, but we really need to see how far this develops. And part of this, too, is that in my mind, I'm thinking that there could be options where Dubravka would be sort of replaced over this window in January. So we'll need to see what happens. I think it's pretty unlikely as it turns out. As far as Neto, he gets a sort of introduction to the cheat sheet simply because we know that this Bournemouth team, even though they have 2 slightly bad fixtures sort of remaining on the radar, look, ultimately, as soon as game week 23 comes around, you have a pretty high chance of a double game week. And anytime you have a double game week keeper, it's actually very interesting, particularly if the double game week is good. And it probably is going to be good because it is a Luton game. So that could be quite interesting. So that's sort of the landscape of the cheat sheet right now. A little bit of a longer video, but I really appreciate you guys for staying and watching if you've sort of reached the end of the video. So thank you guys for your support this season. I've really enjoyed it. And let's look forward to the next video, which is going to be my team selection. But otherwise, take care and goodbye, and I'll see you guys in the next video.